All right, well, good morning once again to everybody online. As Phil said, if you have any questions, about something that we go through, or you have a question about something that I said, you want to add something, we're going to give that a try and see how it goes. So I thought, we just finished up our series on art in the early Christian ecclesias and the early Christian movement and community. I thought that it would be worthwhile to take a look at a very important event, obviously in the history of Judaism, but also with early day Christians as well. And that's the fall of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. And when we think about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, we often think of, and rightfully so, Jesus, for instance, in Matthew, the 24th chapter, and in Luke as well, where he gives this prophetic, prophetic sermon or prophetic, preaching about the end of Jerusalem, about Jerusalem being destroyed. No stone will be stacked on one another. It's all going to be torn down. But in a wider sense, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 just really had profound consequences. For the Jewish people in particular, and also for the early day Christians as they, try to spread this new religion. So I'm probably going to need a couple classes for this. So, I know Brother Jim Boyko was sad to hear that, and I'm going to have to take another day. But we'll figure it out. But for the first class, anyways, we're going to definitely look at the background of the fall of Jerusalem. How did we get to the point where, Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans? It seems like there was a pretty hardcore progression. Well, there was, from, under Herod the Great all the way up until the Romans got there. How did we get to the point where the temple is? Brother Butch, how are you doing? A lot of questions for you today, buddy. How did we get to the point where the Roman legions come marching into Jerusalem and just kind of slaughter everybody and burn the temple to the ground? So we'll look at the background today, probably get into some causes today as well. Next week we'll probably take a look at the siege, the destruction of Jerusalem as well, and the aftermath. So this was a great topic for me anyways, because there's a lot I didn't know about this time. Like the particulars about the history. I had a general understanding of it and how it happened, but it's really an incredible story about how Jerusalem fell. Why didn't Jerusalem just kind of continue on under Roman rule and be prosperous and, deal with the Romans and go on with life? It really wasn't possible because of the political situation that was going on in Israel at the time. And remember, this is the political situation that John the Baptist is going to be born into. Obviously, this is the political situation that Jesus is going to be born into as well. And he was part of this. And this comes through his teachings, right, in the Gospels, where, Jesus is talking about Jerusalem and the importance of the temple and how corrupt the temple had become, and people were kind of turning their nose at the temple. It had become very, very centered on money and authority and that type of thing. So with that said, let's get into it. Hit the right button here, Bush, you'll see. Oh, all right, so up on the screen you should see a couple maps. The first map is of the Roman Empire during, right around this time, the turn of the century into the Common Era, as they call it today. Year zero, which is kind of impossible, but it's year zero. And you can see in the green, Rome just didn't wake up and all of a sudden control the Mediterranean, right? It was a process. Different types of wars. They first started out in Italy, as a very small, tribe really, and they slowly through conquest and, making deals with other tribes and other cities, they grew. And they took over all of Italy, and then they went up into, up into Gaul, modern-day France, over to Spain. They had three massive wars with the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, right? They had called the Punic Wars. And again, they just slowly but surely expanded their power to the point where they took over all of the Mediterranean, right? All the Mediterranean is taken over. Rome controls everything. Now, under the Roman Republic, and this is important to note, under the Roman Republic, they had a different outlook of things, particularly as far as control. Remember, under the Republic, there was no emperor. They, the Senate controlled everything. The big patrician noble families of Rome controlled everything. So it was much more, quote-unquote, democratic, right? It certainly wouldn't be democratic under our ideas of democracy, right? Because, only men could vote of a certain age. They had to own, had to have wealth and land and stuff like that. Anyways, that idea is going to change once the emperors come here. Julius Caesar wasn't really an emperor, but he was a dictator. He's the one that said, hey, look, I'm a dictator for life. I'm the leader. And he kind of bullied his way to being the leader of Rome. And then afterward, his successive emperors after that all became emperors. And they're like, hey, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, end of story. Anyways, and they're going to force other countries or other nations that they kind of control, particularly under their empire, they had to offer sacrifices and incense and prayers to the emperor, which didn't happen under the Republic. So that change in philosophies from the Romans is going to have a profound impact, particularly on Jerusalem and the Jews. Because the Jews are like, listen, the emperor isn't a god, number one, and we're certainly not going to be offering up, sacrifices to a god. We'll say prayers for a man and for the leaders of the people, no problem, but this idea of now offering sacrifices to a god is off the table. And that there's going to be major friction between the Romans and the Greeks and the Jews. The Romans and the Greeks can go, look at these guys. Who are they to decide? Offer sacrifices. What's the problem? Anyways, and the Jews also are going to have, different dietary laws. They're going to have, different practices, ritual practices. One that pops into mind that was a really was a no-go for the Romans and Greeks was circumcision. That was like, yeah, no thanks, guys. Anyway, so that's, so that was Rome slowly but surely conquers all the Mediterranean. We won't get into that too much. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see, Herod the Great, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but Herod's going to rule from 37 BC to 4 BC. A considerable length of time. And he's going to fundamentally change how Israel looked. He's going to be the great builder. He's the one that's going to support the building of the temple in Jerusalem, making it a magnificent structure. He's also going to build aqueducts. He's going to build Roman amphitheaters and other Roman type of buildings. In Jerusalem, but also in other places, particularly in Caesarea, and we'll look at that. But this is what Judah and Israel, Judah, Samaria, and Galilee is going to look like, right? Judah is down below there with Jerusalem, and then up in the north is Galilee. I always thought it was interesting that between Judah and Galilee was Samaria, right? So the further north you go, the religious leaders and the political leaders in Jerusalem look down on the north, right? Galilee, it's just a bunch of crazy people living up in the north. They're never satisfied. There's always problems up in Galilee. They got wacky ideas, right? The Samaritans obviously were hated by the religious Jews as well. So anything north of Jerusalem, the further north you went, the less kind of, the more out of mainstream religious society you went into. So, and that's going to play a part as well. Questions, comments on this before we go on?
Was it the Romans that put Herod into power?
Yeah, so we're gonna get into that. Yeah, so Herod the Great was a great politician, Butchie, and he's gonna play the game, and he is going to make friends. His family's gonna make friends with the Roman elite, and they're gonna use this friendship and political connections to really establish themselves. Yeah. Herod the Great was, he had a significant amount of independence, but he was definitely supported by the Romans, without question. And he wanted to cultivate that. You know, he wanted the Rome. He wanted trade with the Romans, the peace, and all that kind of stuff, without question. All right. So let's take a look at Herod the Great. It's obviously important to kind of give some background into why Jerusalem fell and, you know, the great destruction that came about that. So Herod the Great really is considered the great because he was a great builder. The temple at this time was one of the great structures of the world. I think it was the largest structure of the world as far as mass was concerned. And you know, the temple is on top of the Temple Mount, but the structure that the actual temple is on is another massive building. So the temple really is on the roof of a massive structure that it kind of housed the top of the temple, which is incredible. He's going to build Caesarea, which is right on the water, a beautiful Roman city with Roman architecture, Roman aqueducts, beautiful baths. It was like a seaside town. And it just as an aside, it's interesting, you know, like Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate and the Romans, the Roman authorities in Israel and in Judah, really wanted nothing to do with Jerusalem. They thought Jerusalem was a crazy city. You know, there's always a problem in Jerusalem during this time. And it was true. And, you know, it was a packed city. It was kind of, you know, it was landlocked. It wasn't near the ocean. And so the Roman authorities would have much rather just stayed in Caesarea and enjoyed the baths and the seaside, you know, the fresh sea air, and taking long walks on the beach. You know what I'm saying? And they got to go down, we got to deal with Jerusalem again. So this is, just keep that in mind, right? That's a little friction, and there's a little resentment on the Romans' part, right? That they got to deal with Jerusalem. You know, it's like, oh, here we go again. You know, it's kind of like being an administrator or something like in a school, right? And it's really like 10% of the kids that you're dealing with over and over and over again, right? Here we go. And so I think Jerusalem really kind of fell in that category. Not that they were bad or anything, but there was always an issue, right? Okay. The Romans said it, as we talked about, Butchie. They are going to declare Herod king of the Jews. You, sir, are king of the Jews. All right, great, fantastic. So he's going to use the fact that he is proclaimed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. You know, kind of one of the most powerful institutions at this time. Remember, there's no emperor during this time, okay? It's the republic ruled by the Senate. There's some consuls and stuff like that. Anyways, Herod was a very paranoid guy, and he was a very violent guy as well, okay? And so on the one side, he's great because he was a great builder. He loved building things. Okay, you can understand that. But anybody that had a claim to the throne, particularly in his family, he's going to kill. Right? I think he killed a few of his sons. I think a couple of his wives as well. It wasn't, it was pretty unhealthy to be around Herod and be an heir to the throne. Right? Now, this is interesting as well during this time. Remember, you know, the building of the temple, the second temple, is going to last for some 40 years. And the building of the temple really never ended because there was always something to do there, right? There was upkeep. There was, hey, we're going to build this there, we're going to expand this, that, and the other thing. But once the majority of the building was completed, you know, you had thousands of workers that were out of a job, right? So what do you do with all these people? You know, they've been working year after year after year building this massive structure. And now all of a sudden it's complete. What do you do with them? And so there's going to be a certain amount of economic hardship in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas because there's not a lot of job opportunities. And so when there's economic hardship and when there's not a lot of job opportunities, this is where unrest comes in. Now you start looking at Herod and saying, you know, hey, what's the deal with this guy? You know, you look at the religious leaders and you're like, hey, they're not helping us, you know. I hear a lot of this, that, and the other thing, but, you know, I'm suffering here. I don't have a job. So that's interesting. Rome is slowly going to become more and more involved in this area, all right, just because of the unrest and kind of the political intrigue. Remember as well, brothers and sisters, that Syria and Israel is really right on the border of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic. To the furthest extent east, they're kind of right at the border. After that, you go into Arabia, and Persia is up there as well. And, that's not controlled by Rome. And so Rome was always concerned about its eastern frontier. And so you couldn't have on the eastern frontier of their lands instability. And that's why they put someone like Herod into place. They're like, listen, okay, we're going to call him the king of the Jews. We're going to really give him unlimited power. Do your thing, Herod. We support you. But just, you got to keep this place calm. It's craziness over here. We can't have it. And that's pretty much, what went on. But, there was an incredible amount of corruption during this time as well. People skimming off the top, by the Romans as well, by the way. And this is going to be one of the big things, too, was this idea of taxation. Like, the Jews were being taxed like crazy. They were taxed by, Herod. There was a temple tax, and there was also a Roman tax as well. So they're getting it from 3 different sides. This is a very poor area for the most part. There are pockets of wealth within Israel, but it's very small. And so these people are being ground to dust, really, by the Romans. And so if we look at the ancient prophets, right, and just coming to mind, like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, those prophets, they always talk about the poor, like how the elites or the kings and the princes, the rulers, how do they treat the poor? And that was one of the big things with the prophets. Like, hey, you need to treat the poor better, the fatherless, the widow. You need to help these people. You can't just use them for your own gain. And so very religious Jews looked at the oppression by the Romans, particularly around taxation, as, a fight between good and evil, between righteousness and wickedness. The Romans were wicked for what they were doing. Herod was wicked because of what he was doing. But Herod was a little smarter than the Romans, and Herod played this game with the religious leaders in building them this great temple. And that was kind of the deal, right? Hey, I'll build your temple, but just leave me alone. Stop with your nonsense. And so that was the deal. Judea is going to really become a satellite of Syria. Damascus obviously was a major city in the ancient world, among other places in Syria. Again, it's on the border. It's on the eastern border of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic at this time. So it's very important from an economic, political, and military point of view as far as the Romans are concerned. So they're going to get involved more and more and more. Now, this is important. Rome is going to respect the religious and cultural practices of the Jews during this time. They're going to look at the Jews as an ancient people. They got some crazy ideas, particularly around monotheism, there being one God. But hey, the Romans came in contact with a lot of different people and a lot of different gods from other peoples. And they just incorporated it. Okay, no problem. You can follow whatever practices you want. You can, you can believe whatever you want. Just make sure you pay your taxes, okay? Just make sure you're following the rules. Make sure that you're not causing any uproars. The Romans wanted peace in the provinces. We think about the Romans as, they're always going around looking for a fight. And to a certain extent, sometimes that was true in their history. But during this time, during the Pax Romana, they wanted peace. They wanted trade. The money was rolling in, billions and billions of dollars from around the Mediterranean, from Egypt, from Syria, from Asia Minor, Greece. Just think about the wealth that are in these places. And Rome was getting a cut of it all. So they didn't want any problems. And so now, you got this little kind of backwood province that's a satellite of Syria. Oh, you got another problem in Judea again. All right? And so very slowly Rome's going to put an end to it. Or they think they're going to put an end to it. Right? And so they're going to come in here and like, Rome, do what we say. The religious Jews and the other factions during this time. Let's say again?
So that's a nice Roman accent.
Yeah, right. they're gonna resent the fact that Rome is becoming more and more involved in the politics of the day during this time. Okay, now from 7 BC to 7, that should be 7. That should be 36 CE, right, or AD. You know, whenever you see CE now or AD, it's the same. Right? The number isn't going to change. They just change, AD, the year of our Lord in Latin. You can't have any connection with Jesus, but it's the same date. So anyways. All right, it's relatively peaceful. Herod is going to kind of keep peace, but we know from the Gospels, there was still upheaval during this time. But Herod is going to really kind of settle things down. He's going to have his building. He's a despot, by the way, right? He's not a good guy, but he's great in the sense that he built a lot of great things. I just got a text. Let's see what this is. This is from Brother Jason Deneen, who's been to Israel numerous times. Have you ever heard that? Okay, this is a good question from Jason. If you're inclined, where did the Romans who served in Jerusalem live, and what were their habits and free time activities when they were not working as soldiers? That is a great question. He's not a plant, by the way, Jason, we'll get into that. That's a great question. Let me just say this. The religious practices and the cultural practices of the Romans were very different from the Jews as well. And the religious practices of the Romans and the Greeks were offensive to religious Jews. And there's always this tension between the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews as well. All right? But to Jason's point as well, there were garrisons in Jerusalem with the soldiers, and the soldiers were hated by the Jews, right? Because they were a symbol of authority and power. Any Roman that had any money or had any, political power or was connected in any way didn't spend a lot of time in Jerusalem. They spent all their time in Caesarea for the most part. But once, you get Romans with their cultural ideas and the Greeks with their cultural ideas and religious Jews mixing together, didn't work out so well. So, great question. All right. Let's continue on here. Rome's going to continue to kind of dominate the Mediterranean. And, there's going to be some unrest and some issues during the reign of Caligula. Not the best guy in the world, if you know any background of Caligula. Just really a decadent guy, an immoral guy, very perverse guy. And even the Romans started to hate him because of the things that he was doing. And the Praetorian Guard, which was kind of his bodyguard, ended up killing him and his whole family. We've had enough of you, buddy. But during this time, Rome is going to have some issues, particularly in Egypt, as far as, the governor there. Caligula thought that he wasn't loyal enough, and there were some uprisings and stuff like that. But anyway, we won't get into that. Now, the grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, right, the first, because of Herod the Great's connection with Rome, his grandson is actually going to he's going to grow up in Rome within the royal family, within the family of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Okay, he knows all 3 emperors. Think about that. He is politically in, baby. In fact, Caligula is going to send Herod on different missions, like domestic, diplomatic missions and stuff. So he's tight with the ruling family at this time. And so he's going to use this relationship, Herod Agrippa, to extend his power and to extend his territory. He's really going to control all of the area from Syria in the north all the way down to Idumea, which is down in the southeastern part of what is modern day Israel. Okay, he is going to become one of the great kings of the East. He's going to have that much power. Okay, he's going to be the king of the Jews. And so, because of his connection with the royal family in Rome, he's going to be a king that's going to have a lot of influence and a lot of power during this time. he's going to be well liked by the Jews. He is, the religious Jews at this time, they're going to be fine with King Agrippa. He's going to continue the process, the policies of the temple. He's going to let the priests and the high priest kind of run the things of the temple. He's not going to persecute any Jews. And he's going to get along with the religious leaders at this time. The early Christians, not so much. And if we want, you can take a look at Acts, the 12th chapter, right, as far as the persecution that's going to go on by King Herod Agrippa I. And this really it was a political decision by Herod Agrippa here to persecute the Christians and to kill some of the leaders during this time. I think James was killed during this time, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, the Jews are like, hey, what's this, what are these Christians doing? Hey, King Agrippa, you got to do something about it. Oh, no problem, guys. I'll handle it right now for you, right? And that was kind of the relationship that happened. This is interesting, and we'll get into this in the next slide. But one of the things that he did, which was actually very important as far as, kind of calming things down during this time, Caligula is kind of going to lose his mind. Right? And he's going to do whatever he wants to do. He made his horse a member of the Senate, right? Which is kind of funny. But Caligula is, in order to kind of get back at the Jews and stick it to the Jews because of all of the Jews belly aching in their riots and stuff like that, he's gonna proclaim that on the Temple Mount itself, right before you go into the temple, he says, I want a statue of myself right outside the temple, please. And it's like, well, hey, that's not a great idea. It doesn't matter. I said what I said, right? And so that was the plan. He wanted to stick it to the Jews. He wanted to put a statue of himself right outside the temple. Now think about this for a second, brothers and sisters. Not only do you have really a wicked king, right? He was really a wicked guy. But you have a Roman emperor now forcing a statue of himself, who proclaims himself as a god, a statue of a god, a Roman god, a living god outside the temple of Yahweh. I think we can very clearly understand that that's not going to sit well with any of the Jews, not even the mainstream Jews. You know what I'm saying? Never mind like the zealots and the other groups. They're going to go bananas, and that's exactly what happened. Now, thankfully, at this time, Herod Agrippa is going to kind of use his influence and just going to say, hey, not a great idea. Maybe, let's slow play this one, right? And the governor of Syria at the time, he agreed, and he really slow played it. It like took him a year, I'm going to research it. I'm going to have this committee to look at it, all this kind of stuff. Anyways, it never happens, right? The statue of Caligula never gets placed on the Temple Mount, which, had it happened now in 37 AD, most likely, that would have been the start of the rebellion in earnest, most likely. But it's put off. It's kind of put off for about 30 years or so. The other thing that he did that's going to be very important with the siege of Jerusalem is Herod Agrippa is going to fortify the walls. He's going to build his three different kind of walls, right? There's the outer wall, inner wall, and then kind of the last wall of defense around the temple, which still, the western wall, right? He's going to fortify the city. Now, Claudius, the emperor, who he knows personally, has a friendship with, he's like, hey, what's the story with you building up the walls in Jerusalem? Doesn't Jerusalem have a history of rebellion? Right? It's kind of what the Persians were talking about, right? And so he actually makes King Agrippa stop building. He's like, listen, we're good friends, but I don't really feel comfortable with you building up the walls of Jerusalem. I don't know what I trust you, but it's the people that come after you that I don't necessarily trust. And maybe you didn't even trust Agrippa either. Remember, this is, in the ancient world, and I guess it's true today too, politics is just full of sleaze, right? And there's backstabbing and everything else. And you're always doing what is best for not only yourself, but also for whatever country you're representing. And it was no different with the Romans and the Jews at this time. Okay? This picture up here on the top right, this is kind of a recreation of what Caligula would look like, right? Average looking guy, but a real lunatic. And then on the bottom, kind of in the middle, that was the statue that was going to be placed outside on the Temple Mount, outside of the temple. Remember, when we look at Roman and Greek statues, they're all just like marble, like white marble. That wasn't the case in the ancient world. They would paint these. They would paint them up, and they would look awesome. They would look like a real person. And so, here is Caligula right here, the statue, and he's got his royal purple robes on, right? So just kind of imagine if this statue went up outside the Temple Mount. It would go crazy. Anyways, questions, comments from anybody here or online before we go on? All right. Okay, now we're going to get into kind of, the foundation of the great uprising that is going to happen in Judah and other places. As an aside, we have to remember that in Egypt, Alexandria is really right on the coast. It's in northern Egypt, and it's right on the coast of the Mediterranean. One of the great cities of the ancient world, by the way. Incredible source of trade and incredible source of wealth. The Jews had a major community, a major community in Alexandria. Some ancient sources say up to 1 million Jews are going to live in and around Alexandria. So there is a sizable, politically astute and politically powerful Jewish community in Alexandria. Riots are going to break out in Alexandria during this time, and we'll get into it a little bit later on why they were. But remember, there's this tension between the Greeks and the Romans and their culture and the culture of the Jews as well. Okay? Did they get along? Yeah, they got along. But every now and then, there's going to spring up or bubble up to the surface these underlying tensions between the polytheistic Greeks and Romans and the monotheistic Jews as well. Remember, the Jews are also going to they're going to separate themselves as well. They're going to, live in these cities, but they're going to have their own community. And they're always going to be looked at with suspicion, right? Like, what's this, who are these guys, right? The other thing is Jews, what do the Jews do whenever they go to a city? What is really one of the first things that they do when they go to a new place? If you had a group of Jews and their families going to a new town or city, what's the first thing they're going to do? Thank you. Brother Jim says build a synagogue. Absolutely. They're going to build a place where they can worship together, right? And that's really what they did. And so there were synagogues all over the place in Alexandria. The Greeks are going to accuse, the Greeks and Romans, when I say Greeks and Romans, it means like they're not the Jewish people, right? The rest of the people, the Greeks and Romans, the Gentiles. They're going to accuse the Jews in Alexandria of not honoring the emperor, right? Remember that shift from the republic to the emperor, right? Now it's an empire. Not only is like Caesar Augustus, right? Not only is he a great leader, he's the emperor, but he's also a living God as well, right? And this is the idea. That began with that started with Julius Caesar, and that's going to continue on. The emperor is going to be deified as a god, and there's no place for this in Judaism, absolutely none. You can't reconcile it. Again, you can offer prayers for the safety and support and so on and so forth of the emperor, right, or of the republic. That's we're commanded to do that, aren't we? We pray for the people that are in charge. Same was true in Judaism. That was fine. They had no problem with that. But now I've got to worship. I've got to recognize, Tiberius or Caligula as an emperor, as a god. Emperor's fine. He's not a god though. No Kanduski. And so this is where that tension now is going to kind of ratchet up. Now, in order, the governor of Egypt at this time, he's trying to play political games as well. And in order to placate the Greeks, he is going to force the Jews to kind of place statues of Caligula outside of their synagogues, right? And again, it's just to kind of show that the emperor in Rome is superior to any other religious group, any other political group. We're Rome. I'm the emperor. You do what you're told. So you have a monotheistic group of people who are now being forced to put a Roman god, a statue of a Roman god outside of their synagogues. Again, you can understand where this really hatred is going to come from. So what do? They try to appease to the governor and other people. That didn't work, so they riot, right? There's riots, there's killings, they're going to burn certain things, right? Remember, the Jewish community in Alexandria is massive. It's not like, hey, there's 200 Jews in Alexandria. We're talking up close to 1 million Jews that are living in Alexandria. So when they rioted, it was a big deal, right? So again, we already talked about this, but as a punishment because of this behavior, because of the riots, Caligula is going to be, okay, not only do you have to put, a statue of myself outside the synagogues, you got to put it outside the temple as well, right? So Jewish anger, both within Judea, in Jerusalem, in Galilee, but also outside in some of the diaspora communities, there's going to be intense friction and anger towards Rome's continued interference into their religious and cultural identity and practices. Like, Rome, mind your own business, right? We're handling this. This is our community, right? We're the chosen people. God has given us we've received the oracles of God. You handle your own business. We're going to be fine. We'll pay our taxes, but stop interfering. And Rome's like, hey, we'll interfere wherever we want. We're Rome. And so, you have two unmovable objects that are really going to crash into each other. So this begins the rise of the Zealots. And we'll get into who the Zealots were and why they're going to be really so important to this. They're really going to take over this whole thing. Okay? It's interesting here, brothers and sisters, too, that the Zealots, the Zealot movement, is going to start in Galilee as well. Okay? So Galilee is really this hotbed of kind of, religious ideas like purification, that type of thing. The Essenes, right? Remember, they're a very aesthetic group, and they're going to move out to the wilderness, and they're like, listen, Jerusalem is a lost cause. It's corrupt. It's an abomination, really. It's going to be destroyed. We need to leave. We need to separate ourselves completely from that. The Zealots are like, they were a group, an offshoot of the Pharisees. Okay, well, yeah, let's get into this. Okay, so Galilee is going to be this center of political and religious thought, and it's going to, it's kind of like, like the Wild West of Israel during this time, right? You had all kinds of things going on up in Galilee. I think, didn't the religious leaders say when Jesus, say, can any good thing? Who said that? Can any good thing come from Nazareth? Nathaniel, that's right. Yes. So can any good thing come from Nazareth? And Nazareth obviously was up in Galilee, and so they looked down upon the Galilee all the time, right? They're a bunch of crazies up there. So the Zealots are going to be one of the four groups of Jews that are going to be around during this time, the major ones. Sadducees we know about, the Pharisees, the Essenes, so those four, and the Zealots, right? Four, yes. So who were the Zealots? Well, they were an offshoot of the Pharisees. Religiously, they really just kind of agreed religiously with the Pharisees, right? But there was one difference. They were aggressive, they were fanatical, and they were violent. They used violence as a means to achieve their religious and political goals. Some historians and Bible scholars have, theorized that Paul was a zealot. That he and maybe not in, hey, I say I'm a zealot, but he was a Pharisee, we know that. But Paul was a fanatical guy before his conversion, right? We're told it. He even says himself, I wasted the ecclesia of God, right? Beyond measure, he says. And in, the Acts tells us about that. In Acts, 22nd chapter, I think Acts 8 as well, it talks about him. He's driving the early day Christians out of Jerusalem. He's going up to Damascus, right? And this is where the conversion happens. He's going everywhere. So, he was a zealous guy. He even says, I was zealous for the things of God. Now, whether or not that means that he was, very driven and jealous for God and wanted to live in accordance with God's will and way, or is he saying that, hey, I was a zealot. I had no problem using violence. I had no problem killing people for the cause, for the religious cause. Absolutely, no problem at all. He stones, you're right, he oversaw the stoning of Stephen. Saul, killed a lot of people during this time. So this is, the zealot movement is going to begin in Galilee. So you have Christianity beginning in Galilee. And now you have the zealots beginning in Galilee as well. Really, two different approaches, right? Two different approaches to the Roman problem. What do we do about the Romans? Well, the zealots are like, yeah, I know what to do. Don't worry about it. We got a plan, right? And so the first revolt of this, right, the first kind of uprising, major uprising, is going to happen in 46 AD, 46 CE. And it's going to be called the Jacob and Simon Uprising. And they were named after the two brothers that kind of led this uprising. It was a revolt against Roman rule. It was they were zealots, right? And they're going to use violence. They're going to try to kick out the Romans, particularly in Galilee. Now, this uprising, is going to be localized. It's really going to stay up in Galilee for the most part. That doesn't mean that there wasn't unrest in Jerusalem during this time, but primarily this uprising is going to stay up in Galilee. It's going to last for like a year and a half, 2 years, somewhere around there, but it's really not going to get a whole lot of traction. It's just going to stay up in the north. And people are going to be looking, oh, there's another uprising in Galilee, guys. Oh, shocker, right? And the Romans are going to go in there. The Romans used to call these things police actions, right? Again, there's a disturbance in the peace, right? We've got to go up there. We'll send the legions in. And it wasn't necessarily war. It was just a police action. But police actions were brutal. They were brutal. They went in there and they killed everybody. If they didn't kill you, they took you as a slave. That's it. That's the police action. That's what they did with the uprisings. Rome didn't mess around. Once they put their mind to getting rid of you, it was really pretty much all over. They wouldn't stop until you were destroyed. That was the mentality of the Romans, right? I think there's a famous story of one Roman general, of one city going out to the Roman general that was, besieging the city. And the governor says, look, just so you know, we have enough food for 10 years. And the Roman general said, then you will fall in year 11. Right? So this is the mentality. We'll stay here as long as we want, right? Until, mission accomplished, so to speak. So Jacob and Simon uprising didn't really go anywhere. But, it was a major uprising, right? Only in Galilee. Didn't spread to other places. Certainly not in Jerusalem. The brothers are going to be executed. It's going to, the Romans are going to do what the Romans do and just kind of wipe everything out. Now, this is important to note as well. So you have like the fanatical zealots, right? You've got to use violence. You've got to get rid of the Romans. To some people, the zealots were too soft. Right? Just think about the mentality. And when you understand kind of some of this background, it's like, yeah, no wonder Jerusalem is gonna get wiped out by the Romans. There was no there was no middle ground with these people. So within the group of the zealots, there was a subgroup of even more fanatical, more violent, more aggressive group of Jews called the Sicarii. And they pretty much were assassins, right? Any Roman, any Greek that was living in Israel during this time, and any Jew who supported them, who collaborated with them, they would be killed. They'd go into homes, they'd kill, they'd make raids on villages that supported the Romans, they'd kill everybody there. Now to the right, you can see this is one of the daggers that they would use, right? It was a very small dagger too that fit in this sheath right here in the bottom there. But, this is an up close and brutal movement. It's a bloody movement. And the zealots are really going to take control of this movement slowly but surely. So You can say, well, why didn't the moderates, why didn't the religious leaders and the moderates do something about the zealots? For a long period of time, they did. They held them back. But they gained more and more power to the point where there was almost a civil war. There was. We'll get into that a little later. There's going to be a civil war within Israel on how to deal with the Romans. The zealots and the Sicarii are killing any collaborator that they feel is collaborating with the Romans. And then, the political leaders of this time want more and more help from Rome to get rid of the zealots. And so again, you have this tension. You have the tension between the Jews and the Romans, and you have the tension between the zealots and the Sicarii versus the religious leaders of the day. Question.